Good evening and welcome to tonight's On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers. We are live, so if you have any comments, questions or suggestions during the show, text them to us on, text the word EDGE, a space, and then your name, location and your message to 87778, and we'll try to pick up on any that really hit the mark. They're all charged at standard rates, so why not get texting now? In tonight's show, I'll be talking with a radical firebrand who is also the quintessential gay rights activist and a no-holds-barred fighter of many political and social causes. He also happens to be a Green Party parliamentary candidate and their human rights spokesperson. He's my special guest, Peter Tatchell. Peter, welcome.
Thank you.
You've had the most extraordinary career, so it's almost impossible to know exactly where to start. So I think I'll start at the start and just ask you a little bit about how you became motivated to fight the causes that you're so well known for fighting. So if you can give me a little bit of background.
Well, perhaps I could start by saying it's not so much a career as a crusade. I've never held any official position. I've never been paid for my human rights work in 40 years. It's all voluntary. I make bits of money from research and journalism and things like that. But I live on about £8,000 a year. I've got a very low carbon footprint, as you can imagine. And, you know, what fires me is a love of other people and a love of justice. To me, if we all expressed our love beyond our immediate families and partners and saw love as a universal, that we're all part of a huge, gigantic human family all over this planet, then I don't think we would tolerate the fact that, for example, today, nearly 1 billion people woke up with no safe, clean drinking water, and that tonight thousands of parents will be crying because their children have died from drinking dirty water. This is totally preventable in a world which has got enough resources to feed, educate, house and clothe every single person on this planet. It's an obscenity that we live in such an unequal, unjust world.
Well, I have to agree that does seem incredible, doesn't it? That, as you say, those people are waking up with no water and no clean water. But how did you take it upon yourself? I mean, what was the spur that made you think, I'm not going to become, I don't know, an accountant or a bank manager or something, and dedicate your life so far to doing this? Was there some injustice that sort of peeved you?
Well, it wasn't a plan, it wasn't an intention, but just at a quite early age, I began to sort of recognise that things weren't quite right. I can remember at the age of about 11, I saw the nightly news where white racists firebombed a black church in southern United States, killing 3 young girls and injuring many other people in the congregation.
Was it?
I think it might have been, yeah. Or Birmingham, I think.
Birmingham, Alabama, yeah.
And that really horrified me, that people could do this to other human beings. So it sort of conscientised me about injustice in the world, and the more I learned and the older I got, the more radical and, you know, determined to do something about it I became.
And you do. I mean, you're incredibly brave as well. I mean, I'm not trying to sort of big you up unnecessarily here, but you present yourself in places where you can come to some danger. I mean, you stood in front of Tony Blair's car, didn't you? And it very nearly hit you, for instance, I think that was to do with the Iraq War, is that correct?
That's right, yeah. I sort of ran out in front of his motorcade in Piccadilly in London in protest at the impending Iraq War, which I felt was unjustified and was based on a false premise. As we know,
well,
the fiction of...
I'm sorry, there were weapons of mass destruction there that were threatening our very existence, weren't there?
Like a big knot.
Like a big knot, okay.
Yeah, and I didn't know that his car would stop, and indeed it only screeched to a halt about 6 inches from my legs. But I was glad that I could do something. I know it's only symbolic, but at least do something to say to him and his government that me and millions of others in this country were not going along with his war plans.
So you were like the sort of British equivalent of that chap in Tiananmen Square, weren't you, standing in front of the tank?
I think he was...
his car's more like a tank anyway, isn't it?
He was taking a much greater risk because he was operating in a police state, and I know it's very kind of you to say that I'm brave, but I don't really think I am. I think bravery are the trade unionists in Iran who are being jailed for defending workers' rights, the oppositionists in Darfur who are calling for democracy and human rights against the Sudan dictatorship. You know, these people end up being tortured, jailed, and sometimes executed. You know, that's bravery, and to be honest, I've never, ever done any of those things. So I think it's relative.
Well, you have also been beaten up, haven't you, in Eastern Europe when you went to protest, I think it was gay rights? Where exactly was that?
I was in Moscow last year. The mayor of Moscow banned a peaceful gay rights protest. So at the invitation of Moscow human rights activists, both gay and straight, I went there to support their cause and was one of the people quite badly beaten up by neo-Nazis and Christian fundamentalists who believe that homosexuality is a terrible, terrible sin, and you know, they believe it's against Russian culture, and I ended up sort of you know, on the ground being beaten black and blue, while the Moscow police stood there and watched. And when they'd allowed the neo-Nazis to give me a thorough beating, they then stepped in to arrest me, the victim, while they allowed the assailants to walk off free.
It's interesting, isn't it, how these religious fundamentalists, who presumably are, I don't know whether they were Christian or what...
Yeah, Russian Orthodox.
Russian Orthodox, because that's Christian sect.
Yeah, they were waving their crucifixes and using them to bash peaceful protesters. Talk about muscular Christianity.
I shouldn't laugh. But, I mean, surely the whole basis of Christianity is that, you know, you love your brother.
And your sister.
And your sister. So,
well, not in their book. They have a very selective, you know, interpretation. And for those kind of people, sexual sins, like homosexuality, are to them, you know, some of the worst sins of all. I mean, I remember speaking to some of these people after I was arrested, because some of them were arrested as well, and they openly admitted that, you know, yeah, there were worse things, but, you know, they regard, nevertheless, homosexuality was a major threat to Russian civilization and their plan to restore Russian greatness.
Do they actually think that they can make it go away? It seems to me, and I don't know anything about this, but it seems to me that there have been homosexuals of both genders since time immemorial, and it's not likely they're suddenly going to stop. So...
Well, the one thing they really got irate about was when I reeled off the list of great Russians who've been gay or bisexual.
Like, please,
like Peter Tchaikovsky, the composer, and Modest Mugorsky, another great Russian composer.
Mountain of Bear Mountain.
Sergei Eisenstein, the great Russian filmmaker.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rudolf Nureyev, the ballet dancer.
Ballet dancer.
They were absolutely apoplectic. You know, how dare you insult these great Russian icons?
Yeah, that film Battleship Potemkin that Eisenstein made, that's their cultural icon, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
And Tchaikovsky, I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah. But these people are in incredible denial. You know, they don't want to face up to and acknowledge the fact that many of the people they revere as great national heroes were gay or bisexual.
And, yeah, so, yes, probably I can understand how they would have been a little bit upset, I suppose, about you sort of making it obvious to them that they were wasting their time, effectively. So, one of the things I know you're very keen on is the formation of a UK republic. And obviously the implication of that is an end to monarchy in this country. So can you tell me a bit about that, please?
Yeah, I just think that the monarchy is a relic of feudalism. You know, it's symbolised as the aristocratic tradition which, you know, ruled over the British people for centuries, and which really, in this modern age, we ought to be shot of. You know, we should have a democratically elected and accountable head of state, someone we can choose, and if they don't do well, who we can replace.
Do you think there's a chance that if we did choose, that people would actually choose the Queen? Because, I mean, there are a lot of people who think that she, you know, does a good job for Britain and is a good ambassador, and you look at some presidents in other countries who are very often venal and just stealing, and everybody hates them, and, you know...
Yeah, I'm not in favour of an executive president like the French or United States president. I'd like to see a low-cost, purely ceremonial president
President of the week or something.
Democratically elected, like they have in Ireland.
Yes.
Now, the Irish president, Mary McAleese, is held in very, very high regard by the Irish people. She's a unifier. She costs 1/20th of the official cost of the British monarchy. Yet when you actually factor in the security costs, you know, they say the royal family only costs about £40 million a year. When you bring in the security costs, it's more like £150 million a year. And that's an extraordinary price to pay when you think in Ireland they can do it for a few million.
Well, the thing I suppose about our royal family is that there are lots of them, whereas there's only one Irish president. So if you're looking after one person, it's obviously a lot cheaper than a whole breeding family, isn't it?
Well, this is true. But I wouldn't want to reduce it purely to a matter of cost. I mean, it really is the democratic principle. The idea that because someone is born into a particular family, that they should have the right to be head of state. That's a profoundly anti-democratic ethos. Well, and I think this particular family has had a mixed bag. You know, just remember, King Edward VIII was a Nazi sympathiser. You know, that's what you get when you base the head of state on the fluke of family inheritance.
Yeah, I've seen photographs of Prince Philip standing next to Nazis as an event, pre-war, admittedly, but standing there with a bunch of Nazis who were in full dress uniform.
There's also something inherently racist about the royal family because, you know, under the current system, whereby our head of state is descended from the Windsor family line.
Which is really the Battenbergs.
Yes, really the German Battenbergs, yes, and the Saxe-Gotha-Coburgs or whatever they are. You know, under that system, because it's a white family, no black or Asian Briton could ever be our head of state. And I find that profoundly offensive and deeply racist.
Or until recently any Catholic either. I believe they've changed that, haven't they?
No, they haven't changed that.
They haven't. Any Catholic.
Yeah.
So if you're Catholic and black, you haven't...
Yeah, or Muslim or Jewish.
Or Jewish.
Yeah, it's a rotten system which is out of step with the democratic ideals which we claim to profess.
I was interested to see also on your website that you had a comment about Princess Diana, who of course is a nation's favourite, about her will. Would you like to explain about that a bit?
Well, I happen to think that, you know, as far as royals go, you know, some of her concerns and issues like, you know, getting rid of landmines and supporting people with HIV and AIDS were very good. But, you know, she wasn't quite as caring as some people seem to make out because, you know, in her will, from the published results, she didn't leave a penny of her £20 million to charity. She left it all to her own family, to her sons. And you would have thought that someone who was supposedly the caring people's princess might have left, you know, £1 or £2 or £3 million to some of her favourite charities.
You would have thought that. I was very surprised to read that, actually. We're getting some texts in now, and don't forget, if you want to text in, it's 87778, put the word edge, and then your question. There's one here from John in Chorley in Lancashire, and he says, what's Peter's take on the farce in Rhodesia? Interesting, he calls it Rhodesia, I think. And does he agree with me that Morgan Tsvangirai, however brave and well-meaning, he's been cut off. If you limit your text to 160 characters, please, otherwise they get cut off. So what do you think about Zimbabwe and former Rhodesia?
Well, I think as everybody knows, in 1999, I and some of my colleagues ambushed President Mugabe's motorcade in London.
Another one.
And actually had him under arrest.
You made a citizen's arrest, didn't you?
Made a citizen's arrest. We had him under arrest.
Why did you let him go?
With all the legal documentation, and the Metropolitan Police and the Labour government conspired together to let him go.
This is Blair's government, isn't it?
Yeah, this is absolutely, yes. And, you know, if they had enforced the law, and we had, everything was legally watertight. You know, he should have been put on trial on charges of torture. We had the evidence. Under British law, anybody who commits, authorises or condones torture anywhere in the world can be arrested and tried in this country. The British government knew that, the police knew it, but they let him go. Now, just think what might have happened if they'd put him on trial. I think having, you know, decapitated the leadership, so to speak, by a legal process, I think the ZANU-PF regime would have imploded way back in 1999, and we would not have had the horrors, the murders, the kidnapping, the rapes, the mass starvation that we've had for nearly a decade now.
Well, it is a thought, isn't it? It would have made a big difference. What about the state of Zimbabwe now, then? Because it does seem to be in one unholy mess.
Well, quite clearly, Mugabe's attempt to have this so-called coalition government is an attempt to try and,
Right, we've got to go for a break now. If you'd like to text in your questions or comments, do so now. Please send the word EDGE, then your message to 87778. See you very soon. Welcome back to On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers, and my special guest, Peter Tatchell. Peter, before the break, we were talking about Zimbabwe and the almighty mess that is there. I mean, how do we get rid of tyrants? What is the problem with getting rid of tyrants?
I think one of the biggest problems is the fact that we have a whole range of international human rights law which has evolved over the last half century, from the Genocide Convention to the Torture Convention and so on. But under these conventions, by diplomatic protocol, heads of state and other senior officials are exempt from prosecution. Now, it strikes me as utter madness that a head of state like Robert Mugabe or Omar al-Bashir of Sudan or the dictators in Burma...
Or Pinochet, who was also arrested here, wasn't he?
All these people can be exempt from prosecution because they hold high office. These are the main perpetrators.
These are doing the most damage,
If the
aren't they?
people doing the damage are the ones that exempt, what's the point of having international human rights law? So one of my big campaigns is to try and increase pressure on governments and the United Nations to end immunity for heads of state and other senior government officials. And of course, it's not just Robert Mugabe or these people. Going back to my youth, Henry Kissinger, the former US Secretary of State, who authorized the indiscriminate mass bombing of Cambodia, an illegal act of aggression.
With whom America wasn't at war, wasn't it?
Absolutely. An illegal act of indiscriminate aggression against civilian populations, which killed or wounded hundreds of thousands of innocent people. He has never, ever stood trial. And my question is, why not? He should.
Yes, well, possibly he should, but it's not terribly likely, I suppose, is it, really?
Well, I did try in Bow Street Magistrates Court to get an international arrest warrant for him.
Kissinger.
And in fact, the magistrate did entertain my application. It went on for 3 days.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
And it even came to the point where the magistrate said, well, I've looked at all the evidence and, there's something to consider here, but do you really propose that I should issue an arrest warrant, which would mean that Mr. Kissinger, a former US Secretary of State, could be locked up in Pentonville prison like a common criminal? To which my reply was, well, perhaps not. Perhaps we could put him under house arrest. I know a very, very nice estate agent. I realise that Mr. Kissinger loves Oxfordshire. I have here a list of properties in Oxfordshire. Perhaps he could be detained under house arrest, as General Pinochet, of course, was. In the end, the magistrate did not allow the arrest warrant, but only because he wasn't convinced that I, as a private citizen, could bring the necessary witnesses to London to demonstrate and give evidence that Henry Kissinger had authorised these bombing raids. So if I'd had more resources and a bit more support, maybe that arrest warrant might have been issued.
So, just out of interest, who else is on your list for this kind of action? Who would you arrest? If you could say, the fairy of justice, perhaps I shouldn't use the word fairy, I'm sorry, perhaps some justice guru who said to you, you could have one person at the bar, prosecuted, who would that be?
I think it's very, very hard to, decide on one person because there are so many human rights abusers at large, and I think they all should be put on trial, as Slobodan Milosevic was.
Yes.
But why only him? Why is it that only Slobodan Milosevic and now Charles Taylor, the ex-leader of Liberia, have been taken to the World Court or the International Court, Why only them? Why not all the others?
Could it be because they haven't got enough clout? You know, they're just from little countries.
This is a lot of it is to do with great power politics. We know that, for example, Israeli leaders who have authorized or condoned war crimes in Lebanon against the Palestinians, they will probably never stand trial because they are protected by the United States and the British governments.
Right.
It isn't about justice, it's about power and big power politics, and that's fundamentally wrong because everyone should be equal before the law and all human rights abusers, whoever they are, should face justice.
OK. I've got a text here which I'm going to run past you. It says, what is your theory on 9/11, also the death of Diana? And then they go on to say, good luck in all your activities. You seem a very kind and intelligent man. God bless. Which I suppose is nice. So what about that? What do you think about 9/11 and the death of Diana?
Well, I think some of you may know that I wrote a piece for The Guardian about a year ago where I seconded the views of some of the members of the 9/11 Commission. These were people appointed by President Bush who expressed concerns that the Commission of Inquiry was underfunded and hampered by restrictions from the outset, and that in their view many questions were not answered because they didn't have access and were not given access to the witnesses and the evidence.
Yes.
And they did accuse official US government agencies of obstructing their inquiry. So my view is that that inquiry should be reopened to ensure a full, objective, no-hold-bars investigation of what actually happened.
Because there's been no explanation, for instance, in the official explanation of how a 47-storey tower block, Building 7, collapsed on the same day.
Well, there are many different theories, some convincing, some not, but whatever, there needs to be a proper, independent investigation, and one that goes to the heart of the matter, that's properly funded and staffed. And as we know, there are many, 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 many people in public life, you know, in the United States, esteemed scientists, politicians, engineers and so on,
yes,
who have added their names to calls for a proper inquiry because they do not believe that the official report gives the full picture.
OK, that's good. What about Diana, the ungenerous Diana, who in death revealed somewhat more of her true nature? What about her?
Well, I think about her death, again, I'm fairly satisfied with the official explanation, but I do think there are some curious and odd question marks.
Like all the cameras being out.
Exactly, yeah. You know, for so many CCTV cameras to have been out of action.
It always seems to happen, doesn't it? It happened with the John Charles de Menezes, you know. The cameras didn't work.
It could be coincidence. You know, coincidence does happen. But it also strikes me as somewhat unusual, and there are aspects of the investigation into the so-called, you know, white Fiat Uno or whatever it was,
yes,
which really have not been tied up. And again, I'm not saying there was a conspiracy, but I think we ought to know the answer. And I think, you know, that when you have unanswered issues, matters that have not been put to rest, then that does leave a question mark. And I think the public has a right to know whether it's Princess Diana or an ordinary person in the street.
Yes, fair enough. One of the things I wanted to ask you about particularly is about religion and hypocrisy. And I know you've written a lot about this and you've discussed this subject a lot and you've acted a lot on this subject. So can you give me a sort of overview of how you view world religions and particularly hypocrisy within those religions?
Well, it's curious, isn't it? Because, you know, religion is supposed to be about love and compassion. It's supposed to be about altruism. But in many cases, it's quite the opposite. It's about hatred, prejudice, sectarianism, and all the bad things that we associate with the troubles in Northern Ireland, with conflicts all around the world, which are often religiously motivated or incited. And I just think it's pretty clear that on a global scale, organised religion is probably the biggest single threat to human rights. You know, wherever we look around the world where there's conflict, it's usually got a religious angle, and it's usually religious leaders who are stoking the flames of violence and hatred. And nowhere more clearly than in Iraq, where Sunni and Shia religious leaders are at war over religious interpretations, amongst other things. But no doubt, there's no doubt at all that whereas Saddam Hussein represented a Sunni-dominated regime, has now been...
They were the minority, weren't they?
They were the minority, yes, and they did persecute the Shia. And now the Shia have got the upper hand. They are persecuting the Sunni. And I just think, a plague on all your houses. Muslims and non-Muslims, whoever you are, you've got a right to live in peace and not to be persecuted by religious zealots.
Is there no good that religion does?
Well, there are some very good religious leaders, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who has been a beacon of the struggle against apartheid and for global justice in the world today. He is motivated by his Christian faith, and I think he's used it in very many positive ways to, promote and support a better, fairer world. So that's a fine example of how religion can be a force for good. But I think, really, he is probably an exception.
I've got a very favourite quote from Desmond Tutu. He said that when the white man came to Africa, they asked us to close our eyes and pray, and when we opened our eyes, we had the Bibles and they had all the land.
Absolutely.
So, and what about...
I mean, I think, if you look at the history of colonialism and colonial subjugation and slavery, you will see that it was Christian-dominated nations that led that land grab and that terrible enslavement of tens of millions of people, and they often did it in the name of Christianizing and civilizing people who they condemned as savages. So religion went hand in hand with slavery and colonial subjugation.
What about people like the Dalai Lama? Then how do you feel about the Dalai Lama? Is he part of an evil empire of religions organised for the benefit of the organisers?
Well, I think there are different shades of religious oppression. I think Buddhism on the whole has been much more benign than, say, radical Islam or fundamentalist Christianity. But nevertheless, in Tibet, under the rule of the lamas, there was a great deal of oppression. People were held in semi-slavery. It was a very unjust, cruel society. And I think, to hark back to a glorious age when Tibet was under the rule of the Dalai Lama or his successors, I think is entirely misguided. It's a whitewash of the reality of a great deal of human rights abuse that happened in the name of feudal, aristocratic and religious rule.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's talk a bit about hypocrisy, because one of the things that you did as part of your outrage activity, which is to out homosexual bishops who were acting as though they weren't, and also acting repressively to homosexuality. I mean, tell me a bit more about that.
Well, I think hypocrisy, wherever it appears, is a double standard and needs to be challenged. If someone is preaching against gay people and opposes legal equality for gay people, while themselves privately having secret gay relationships, that quite clearly is hypocrisy, and it needs to be exposed.
So just to get this straight then, so you were outing these people because they were hypocritical, not just because they were happier to keep it a secret.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't about the fact they were gay and in the closet. It was about the fact that they were endorsing a church policy which said that homosexuality was a sin, that gay people should repent, and in many cases they were actively supporting anti-gay laws that discriminate against gay people and harm gay people. For example, in the old days, the unequal age of consent, which criminalised young gay men and their partners, the fact that gay people were banned from serving in the armed forces, the fact that lesbian and gay couples were given no legal recognition or rights. These were things endorsed by Christian leaders. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, was notorious for advocating legal discrimination. Now, it's one thing if he believes that homosexuality is wrong. he's entitled to that point of view. But what he's not entitled to do is to say that his particular homophobic interpretation of Christianity should become the law of the land, and that we should all, whether we're Christian or not, be subject to his hardline homophobic discrimination. And that's why, of course, I went into the pulpit and
you got arrested
on Easter Sunday in 1998 and condemned the Archbishop. I didn't abuse him. I didn't, disrespect the Christian religion. I just said it was wrong for Dr. George Carey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to publicly advocate that the civil law should discriminate and deny human rights to British people who happen to be gay or lesbian.
And this, I hope you won't mind me saying, is the only time you've actually had a criminal record, isn't it?
Yes, and what a criminal record to get.
And what was the thing what Act of Parliament did they try you under?
Well, it wasn't. Yes, it was the
What law?
1860 Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551.
The Brawling Act,
Yep.
even though you were in a pulpit.
Well, under this law, any kind of peaceful protest in a church is illegal.
Even though it's a peaceful protest.
It doesn't matter how brief or peaceful, if you interrupt a minister of religion in a church, it's a crime.
Oh, that's extraordinary.
It's the only institution which has such sweeping laws against the right to protest.
That is quite extraordinary. Anyway, we're going to go for another break now, so please text in your questions or comments to the word EDGE and then 87778, and we'll see you again very soon. Welcome back to On the Edge with me, Theo Chalmers, and my special guest, Peter Tatchell. Peter, we had a text here, and I was going to read it, but it's actually scrolled off the screen, and I'll see if I can remember it. It was about Obama and what Trevor Phillips said, because I think there was a comment that Trevor Phillips said about a black president. Do you have and asking you what you thought about that?
Well, I think it's great that at last, finally, the United States has a black president. That's an enormous achievement, and I think the problem is now, can he live up to expectations? And I'm not too sure that he will. I hope he will, but he is, as president, trapped within a political and economic system that is rigged to sustain the power of big business. There's so much corporate interest at stake that I just find it hard to believe that he's going to be able to significantly change things. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
Yes. I think a lot of people do, don't they? So how long is it before the American people say, change we need, Obama out?
Well, I think they'll give him a fair run. And I think he's undoubtedly going to be far, far, far better than either President Bush or most of his Democratic predecessors. He is the most liberal and radical president the United States has had for a very, very, very long time.
So that is encouraging.
Certainly since Roosevelt.
Since Roosevelt?
Yeah, yeah.
OK, well, that's interesting.
And with regard to Trevor Phillips' comments, he, as you know, said that he couldn't believe that it would be possible in Britain to have a black prime minister. We've got a brown one, but we haven't got a black one. So I'm not too sure he's right. I mean, I think the British people would be open to a black prime minister if that person had the talent, the vision, and the imagination of someone like Obama.
So there is a chance, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been really a problem that a lot of black potential candidates haven't always been selected for winnable seats. There's been a great pressure to fit within the new Labour framework, which is, as we know, Thatcherism by another name. So it's very hard to imagine how a visionary black leader could emerge, or indeed a visionary white leader could emerge, to take Labour or any party in a radical new direction.
So you don't think there are any visionary leaders in the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives, or the Labour Party?
Not at all.
Or in the Independents, for that matter?
The political system is rigged against, independent-minded, visionary people.
I should tell everybody that you are the parliamentary candidate for, is it Oxford East?
Oxford East?
For the Green Party.
That's correct, yeah.
So that was a party political broadcast from Peter Tatchell. There are other candidates.
But I'm not standing for Prime Minister. I'm just standing
No.
for Oxford East.
Oxford East. Well, that's probably, what, 18 months away?
Yeah.
OK. Well,
But I do think there are people, for example, in the Green Party, like Caroline Lucas, our member of the European Parliament for the South East, who does have an element of this visionary approach. But because politics in this country is so focused on the big three parties and the little, narrow, introspective Westminster Village, much of the media and the press and so on don't really give a platform to those who stand outside the mainstream. And that's part of the problem as well. We have a media that gives a very mainstream establishment narrative and doesn't open out, like you are, to alternative voices.
Yes, well, we do try and voice the alternative view here on Edge Media. So let's talk about the state then. Let's talk about democracy. Let's talk about surveillance, ID cards. Where do you want to start?
Well, perhaps a good place to start was what happened a couple of weeks ago. I helped provide materials for the fabulous new exhibition that's taking place at the British Library called Taking Liberties.
Ah, yes.
Which is the history...
You got into trouble again, didn't you,
Which is the
Peter?
history of the struggle for liberty and freedom in Britain over the last centuries. It's a fantastic exhibition. So I was invited along, and lo and behold, at the last minute, I was informed after I'd arrived that the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, was going to open this event.
Talking about liberty.
Talking about liberty.
And freedom.
When the Labour government, not just the Brown government, but its predecessor, the Blair government, has probably done more than any government since the Second World War to undermine the very same precious liberties that this exhibition is praising and celebrating. So I couldn't resist to, I let him finish his speech, but at the end I said to him, Mr. Prime Minister, it's very gracious for you to come to join us tonight. You've been around the exhibition. What have you learned about the protection of liberty, given that your government has done more than any other government since the Second World War to undermine it?
And what did he say?
He just went red, he shuffled his feet, he looked down, and his aides ushered him away. Not even a word of defence.
Not even an attempt?
Not even an attempt to defend himself.
Well, Gordon, if you're watching, you're very welcome to come on the sofa and give us the defence yourself. So,
I mean, it is absolutely shocking when you think what the restrictions on the right to protest. I mean, we're not just talking about the fact you have to get police permission to now demonstrate near Parliament, which is like what the Kremlin did under the days of the Soviet Union.
A woman was arrested at the cenotaph, wasn't she, for reading the names of the dead?
Yeah, that's right.
In Iraq, I believe.
But it isn't just that. There's been a succession of public order laws which now give the police the right to determine where protests will be held, how many people will be allowed to attend, what placards they'll be allowed to display, what slogans they'll be allowed to shout, and for how long they'll be able to remain. This is absolutely draconian power, which is not accountable and not appealable.
So let me guess, if you said something like fluffy bunnies for all, you might get a licence, but if you were saying, let's get rid of ID cards, you might not.
Yeah, well, I mean, the police don't always abuse this power, but sometimes they do. And so, for example, in 1994, when the Islamist fundamentalist group Hizb ut-Tahrir held a mass rally at Wembley Arena in London, where they were advocating the killing of women who have sex outside of marriage, of Jews, and of gay people, myself and 6 colleagues went along to protest. We peacefully protested and held up placards simply saying what they were advocating, exposing their hatred, their violence, their incitements to murder. They weren't arrested, we were. We were arrested and taken to court under public order legislation and under trumped-up charges about obstructing the highway. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous behaviour by the police because these laws exist and an inspector or even someone lower rank can exercise them at will on the spot, and you've got no right to appeal it unless you go to court many months later.
And then, of course, it's rather too late, isn't it?
Rather too late.
But you didn't get convicted of anything? You didn't go to court, did you?
Oh, I did. I did get convicted.
Oh, you did get convicted?
And I won it on appeal.
Oh, I see.
I was able to demonstrate that the police, you know, that we were merely exercising our lawful right to protest. We were not inciting any violence or disorder. That when it came to obstruction of the highway, that in fact, you know, the police couldn't have seen us where we were, that in fact where we were was a legitimate place. But that took 2 years of legal fights. 2 years of legal fights. Did you represent
yourself? Or
I did represent myself in the end, yes.
Oh, well done.
Yeah. So it shows you can win against the system, but it's bloody hard. The system is stacked against peaceful protesters. And, you know, what happened to me is just a litmus test or an example of what is happening to hundreds of people where they're protesting against, you know, climate change and nuclear power, whether they're protesting against the Iraq war. These kinds of things have happened to so many people. And they're just the tip of the iceberg. You know, there's other things going on, like, you know, last year, over 500,000 emails and phone calls were intercepted. Over 500,000. That's extraordinary. Unbelievable. And, you know, there is no evidence that these were necessary or they were matters of national security.
Well, it's unlikely.
They may have been, but we're not allowed to know. It's all under the hidden secrecy of the surveillance state about which we're not allowed to know. There's no proper scrutiny. If we look at the way in which, you know, the government has extended progressively the periods for which people can be held without charge. You know, we started off with 7 days, then we went to 14 days, 28 days. Thankfully, the House of Lords, of all places, defeated the government on 42 days. But the government is minded to extend these powers for as long as they can get away with it. And, you know, that is shocking in democracy.
Even the police don't want it, do they?
Even the police don't want it. And other democracies don't have anything like these powers. In most other democracies, it's, you know, 2, 3 or 4 or 5 days, not 28 days, which we currently have. And then, of course, we have the situation of control orders, which are another form of basically a form of house arrest.
It's like South Africa, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the people who are subjected to these control orders are not allowed to know the evidence against them, and they're not allowed to appeal against it. And under new regulations, the government has the power to seize the assets of people suspected of terrorism or aiding and abetting terrorism, and they're not allowed to know the charges against them, the evidence against them. They just had their assets stolen, taken like that. This is incredibly dangerous, and it's no good people saying, well, you know, these are just a whole lot of nasty people.
So whose assets?
Once these powers are in place, we could all, in certain circumstances, become victims. And particularly if, in the view of, say, an economic downturn and recession, turns into a slump with massive climate change, with huge economic dislocation, these powers could be used to suppress protest, control people. You know, we're likely to have in Britain, in the years to come, climate refugees fleeing low-lying parts of Britain, which will become underwater as encroaching oceans or floods make their homes uninhabitable. Perhaps millions of people will have to flee and relocate to other parts of the country. And this could be a recipe for a great deal of social disorder. Now, in those situations, these powers could be used in a very draconian way. I'm not saying there will be, but it's possible. And we should not assume that just because these powers are not massively abused now, that they will not be massively abused in the future.
So under what grounds can they take your property without explanation?
Well, if you are suspected of being engaged in or preparing or aiding and abetting or facilitating acts of terrorism, the government now has the power to seize your assets. And they don't have to show you the evidence, they don't have to produce the evidence in court. And this can happen to entirely innocent people who happen to just have a friend who happens to be accused of involvement in terrorism. You know, by association. It's now moving to a circumstance where it's guilt by association. You know, one of the
thought police, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the people who was a friend of one of the 7/7 bombers, he was a personal friend, In fact, this person had rescued him from, he'd rather gone astray, and he'd been rescued and brought back to, being a good, upstanding member of the community by this person. And now, because of his association and friendship with this person, he has now faced terrorism charges. On purely circumstantial evidence. On purely circumstantial evidence.
OK, well, let's get away from the specific and get back to the general. I've got a text here. It says, Theo, make Peter reveal his stance on ID cards. Don't let him change the subject. Malcolm in Lincoln.
Well, of course I'm against ID cards because they shift the balance of power in society from the rights of the citizen to the power of the state. And, this whole National Identity Register, a huge database, is, again, open to abuse. It may not be abused right now or in the next 10 years, but who can say what a less benign government might do in the future? Once the powers are there, they're inevitably open to abuse. That's the way governments operate. There are always people in positions of power and authority who will use whatever available instruments there are.
Well,
and ID cards give the basic infrastructure for a snooping state. And that is incredibly dangerous, incredibly dangerous.
Well, they do say that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, don't they?
Absolutely, absolutely, you're right. And, we have to take a stand to defend our right to privacy and the rights of the individual against the state. And ID cards, control orders, restrictions on the right to protest, these are all things that undermine our precious liberties.
Right, we've got to end it there, I'm afraid. That's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you to everyone for watching and for those who texted, and thanks to my special guest, Peter Tatchell. If you've enjoyed this show, please tell all your friends. Next week, we're boldly going where no UK-based TV show has dared to go before, in a special 2-hour-long show, which you will seriously not want to miss. Until then, remember, they're watching you, watching us, watching them. Cheerio.